Good evening, everyone, and welcome. A century and a half ago, an idealistic woman wrote a little book that she thought would change the world. "Go forth, little book," she wrote in its epigraph, "and do thy humble work." David Biale and I and our colleagues in producing the Norton Anthology of World Religions think that we have written a book that can change the world in a small way. But the Norton Anthology of World Religions is no little book. It is two large volumes totaling more than 4,000 pages. Volume 1 anthologizes primary texts, origins to the present, for Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Volume 2 does the same for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Together, these volumes constitute an unprecedented attempt to enable the religions of the world to speak to you in their own words, in their own person, as it were, rather than in the words of others about them. Will anyone actually read 4,000 pages of text? Good question. I answer in good Jewish fashion with another question. Does any visitor to the Metropolitan Museum of Art actually look at every painting and every statue? The answer in most cases is, of course, no. But people visit the Met anyway because they know that inside the front entrance they can procure a map. Our map is our table of contents. And people know that after glancing at the map, they can proceed to whatever artwork they choose and find there a caption, a bit of signage, just enough to let the work itself begin to talk to them in its own language. That's how the Norton Anthology of World Religions works. From its table of contents, a reader can plunge to any individual anthologized text and find there a headnote, just enough explanatory context to enable the text to speak to them directly in its own words. Some of the words are strange. Those words we have glossed or footnoted, always with maximum brevity, always right on the page where the term occurs. The visitor to an individual painting may then consider other paintings in the same gallery, and often enough will discover some more generous signage provided by the museum, longer explanations on a wall, or pamphlets in a plexiglass pocket. The Norton Anthology of World Religion, in the Norton Anthology of World Religions, these correspond to the introductions to periods or movements that each of the 6 associate editors has provided, dividing his or her texts as he or she found appropriate and illuminating. Maps and timelines in a museum help you locate the work you are viewing in space and time. If that matters to you, the Norton Anthology of World Religions does the same for the masterworks of religion. In its scope, nothing comparable to the Norton Anthology of World Religions has ever been attempted. It is not that the texts themselves were not extant. The works we anthologize have already been translated, for the most part. They exist, but they have been available only in the libraries of major research universities and a handful of the wealthiest city libraries. More important, they have not been intellectually available to most readers, even those who have had access to these libraries, because the literatures involved are both voluminous and arcane. They are bewildering, in a word, at first encounter, and so it was necessary to muster a team with the rather formidable learning required to turn the bewildering into the illuminating. The result for someone who wants not to visit but to join this museum, that is, actually to buy the book for the $63 that Barnes & Noble is charging for it online, is not the last word in religion. The last word in religion will never be said. But it is foundational, we dare to claim, foundational for anyone with an even moderately serious interest in the subject. It is only a starting point, but it is a solid starting point. And it is needed because in a world that has no majority religion, the minorities are all mingling as never before, led into contact with each other, be it welcome or unwelcome or even violent, by immigration and the internet. And yet, the comparative study of religion is a remarkably recent phenomenon. Until the third quarter of the 20th century, the study of religion in the United States was largely the study of Protestant theology and the Bible. And even these subjects were studied only at private colleges and universities and in divinity schools like those at Yale and Harvard. At state universities, like the ones where David and I teach, because of the separation of church and state, religion was generally not in the curriculum at all. But then things began to change. In 1963, Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, in the Abingdon v. Schempp case, stated in the concurring opinion, quote, "It seems clear to me that the court would recognize the propriety of the teaching about religion as opposed to the teaching of religion in the public schools." By that time, Protestant America had elected its first Catholic president. And 2 years later, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act inaugurated the enormous ethnic and religious diversification of our universities and other key American institutions that has taken place over the ensuing decades. These changes, taken together, brought about an enormous growth spurt in the study of religion on all American campuses, public as well as private. Programs in Jewish studies led the way, but Hindu studies, Buddhist studies, Muslim studies, and others followed quickly enough. In 1964, exactly 50 years ago, the National Association of Bible Instructors, which was then the principal association of college professors dealing with the subject, formally reincorporated as the American Academy of Religion, whose mission statement today dedicates it to, quote, "the understanding of religious traditions, plural, issues, plural, questions, plural, and values, all plural." As one major scholar wrote back in 1971, perhaps what is happening can be summed up most pithily by saying that the transition has been from the teaching of religion to the study of religion. 50 years in the life of any major academic discipline, certainly in the study of something with the longevity of religion, is not a long time. Religious studies, as a discipline distinct from theology, has still the look of an adolescent, full of energy and talent, but not quite at home in either his body or his mind, not grounded, as we say. And that is just where W. Norton and company and the Norton Anthology of World Religions comes in. Our judgment has been that the field of religious studies, though not yet grounded, may be ripe for an attempt at grounding, for a canon not of dogmas to be believed, but of testimony to be pondered. The goal, as we say in the preface, is not conversion, but exploration, and sometimes exploration begins best in your own neighborhood. An English writer, possibly G.K. Chesterton, was packing for a trip when a friend came to visit him in London. "Where are you going?" the friend asked. "I'm going to London," he replied. "But you're already in London." "So you say, my friend, but I disagree. I have been in London so long that I no longer see it. I no longer hear it. I no longer even smell it. If I want to really be in London, I have no choice but to leave London for a while. So yes, I am going on a trip to London by way of Paris, Dresden, Milan, and Bilbao. And I do look forward so very much to reaching my final destination." The travel metaphor seems to me to accord well with the museum metaphor I was using earlier, since when we travel, visiting the local museum seems to be so much the done thing. In any case, the main attraction this evening, and I am eager to get to it, will be the consideration of selected texts and selected issues from the Judaism gallery of this six-wing museum. Judaism is the world's first global religion, a phrase I am happy to steal from my friend and colleague David. Ancient Israel was global through extensive experience with four empires: the Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, and the Persian. The Eastern diaspora that began with the Babylonian exile was later matched by a more extensive and fateful Western diaspora in the Hellenistic and then the Roman empires. During the Middle Ages, the Jewish diaspora straddled the divide between Christianity and Islam, or Christendom and Islamdom, mediating between the two great cultural realms that owed it so much. In modernity, the Jews, as the great internal other within the West, midwifed the birth of religious pluralism and comparative study in the spirit of Max Müller's dictum, "He who knows one religion knows none." It was not an easy birth, but today the child is alive and growing. Because the criterion for a religion's inclusion in this anthology are three: that it be living, international, and demographically major, Judaism might not have made the cut as demographically too small to qualify. But in a phrase that I believe David might appreciate, Judaism has always punched above its weight. As he begins now to tell you about what he has done in his sixth of this anthology and why, David will be, and I reach here for le mot juste, enhanced by the estimable, formidable Susannah Heschel. And with that, David, mazel tov on what you have accomplished, and Susannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack, for introducing the book and also for the tremendous work that it took to put it together, an anthology of world religions, 2 big volumes, almost 5,000 pages, extraordinary. I would just want to add to it that there is something extraordinary about the selections. That is, you can open the book to almost any page and there's something beautiful that you encounter, something inspiring. And it is indeed unusual, something very new for us to study religions that are not our own religion. But you know, the study of religion was also something that arose with European imperialism. I don't know if we want to talk about that, but I wonder if there is a way in which your anthology helps to overcome some of the tensions that we have, and also causes us to focus not only on the scriptures. You know, we're aware that there's a Hebrew Bible, a New Testament, a Quran, for example, but I don't think many people are aware of the subsequent traditions that interpret and reinterpret philosophically and mystically in each religion, of each body of scripture. And so that's a tremendous gift that you've given us with this set, with this wonderful book.
Well, as usual, Susannah, you've touched on several issues here. Let me begin with the first one, that wherever you open, you'll find something beautiful. I wanted the Norton Anthology of World Religions to be a work that would bear comparison with the other Norton anthologies, which have dealt, of course, with literature, sometimes with art. And I tried hard to have our selections reflect that, but also to choose associate editors like David, who had a sense of style, a sense of daring, and a taste for surprising the reader when surprise was appropriate. And I'm pleased that you think we've succeeded somewhat in that regard. One friend of mine to whom I sent a complimentary copy has been visited by 2 or 3 people, each of whom decided to take a look, and then their look led to a second look and a third look, and they wanted to come back and spend some more time with it. On the subject of European colonialism and the comprehensive study of religion, in the general introduction, I do spend some time talking about how Europe learned to compare religions, and the learning process did begin with imperialism. Significantly for English speakers, it began with England's colonization of India and the discovery there of Sanskrit an ancient classical language older than Greek, and yet related to Greek, and related to the classical languages of Persia as well. A revolutionary discovery that changed the study of language, but also transformed the study of religion. At the time that European colonialism began, Arabic was barely known in Europe. Chinese was not known until the 16th century. And then it was learned only by a few intrepid missionaries. As this language washed back over the West and began to be assimilated, the parochialism of the West, which of course it had carried with it into the first wave of colonization, began to be corrected at home by a new sense of world religious pluralism and cultural pluralism. And I think that's about as much of your questions as I can remember.
Thank you. And Jewish scholars stood at the forefront of so much of this. And David, you and I have known each other for a long time.
Forever, almost.
And I also know, and we all know about your work on Jewish secularism, for example. And I'm wondering how it was for you, somebody who is so committed to secularism, to put together a volume, an anthology on Judaism as a religion. And you know, in some sense, religions are like empires. They want to protect their boundaries, even though their boundaries really are permeable. They try to fight things off often. I wonder how you go about making the selection. That is, what are the boundaries of what constitutes Judaism? Why is it, for example, is the New Testament a Jewish book or a Christian book? Or Jewish Christians, those who were Jews following Jesus, why do they always get put into the Christian category? How do you make these decisions?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, I think Jack may have chosen me in part because I come at this from a sort of secular point of view, although I feel that my career has been somewhat schizophrenic, that is, or maybe bipolar is the better diagnosis. Because I'll deal with a religious subject in one project, and the next thing I'll be at the other end. So I did this book on secular Jewish thought, and now my project is working on a history of Hasidism. So I feel very comfortable actually moving back and forth. I think the question you raise about boundaries is an important one and a difficult one. Jack and I actually discussed, if you remember, the whole question about whether we would have something of the New Testament in the Judaism section. And we decided against it, although one of the virtues of having completed my work on this project 4 years ago is that I can now second guess myself.
Yeah.
And
are there texts that you wish you would put in?
So, you know, so the question of the New Testament, I mean, there's no question that this is, that large portions of this are originally Jewish, and just as Jewish as, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's these various...
Which you also include.
Which I do include, of course.
Yeah.
But I do not have any sections from the New Testament. I have to say that when I opened the Christianity volume and discovered large portions of the Hebrew Bible, I said, why is it in their book? You know? It is in our book, obviously, or in our volume.
Well, I considered not having anything from what Christians call the Old Testament in the Christianity Anthology. But then I looked at what you chose to include, and I realized, well, Christians read different portions.
Exactly. Well, and that's what I convinced myself of once I looked at that. With regard to the New Testament, if we were to include it, and I'm actually very open to that argument, the question is what? In other words, what is there that is particularly Jewish? You know, it's clear that Jesus was very much operating within the Jewish prophetic tradition. But of course, one of the big questions in New Testament scholarship is what did Jesus actually say, as opposed to what the later traditions claim that he said. So there are a lot of very difficult problems, I think, in doing that. But I think that you make a correct point that the dividing line between Jews and Christians takes at least 4 centuries to become really clear. And it's really only probably in the 4th century or so, and maybe even a bit later than that, that Judaism and Christianity go, as they say, their separate ways. So we don't really address that in the book, and maybe that is an important problem. With regard to other texts, I feel that now in sort of hindsight, the texts that strike me that I really think I should have put in, not so much the New Testament, but there are texts from the 20th century that I think I was too cautious.
Such as what kinds of texts?
So, for example, the great anti-Zionist text of Yoel, or Yoelish, as he's known, Yoelish Teitelbaum, Vayol Moshe, which is an amazing diatribe, but I mean brilliantly argued using traditional sources of why Zionism is a sacrilege. I think I should have had a portion of that text in there. And another text.
Do you want to explain? It's a Hasidic.
So it's a Hasidic text, yes.
Yeah.
Satmar, it's a Hungarian.
Did you put in something also from Vayol Moshe in the section on the Holocaust? And what
No,
you
I
said there,
don't
blaming
have.
the Zionists?
I don't have. I mean, actually, it really belongs in the section on Zionism because the Holocaust was not that important to him. Actually, I mean, we all think of. We all know that he said the Holocaust happened because of the Zionists, So, and this is a kind of a scandalous statement. But in fact, for him, what really counted was Zionism. And so where it really belonged was in the Zionist section. And probably some other anti-Zionist texts would have been appropriate.
But you decided not to include those.
Well, I think I hadn't really thought that through.
Did you think it was too offensive?
No. That wouldn't have bothered me. That wouldn't have bothered me. But I think I just wasn't thinking in that direction at the time. Now when I look back, I say, why weren't you thinking about that? And it does belong. Another text which I actually had not studied when I put together our volume, but have studied since, and I actually would include it, is another religious text, but this one is militantly Zionist. In fact, it is, I would even say, murderously so. It is a text by a rabbi named Yitzhak Ginsburg, who wrote a justification for Baruch Goldstein's murder of 29 Arabs in the mosque in Hebron in 1994. It's called Baruch HaGever, and it's I mean, if you can extract yourself from the political message of the text, it is a very, very interesting attempt to think through a kind of militant religious position on the state of Israel. So I think that could have belonged as well.
May I make a comment? In the preface to this work, I talk about second thoughts, if you will, but not so much second thoughts that we, the editors who have produced it, may be having, but second thoughts and objections that we're quite sure our colleagues are going to have. Why on earth did you include that, or how could you possibly have omitted that? But this is all to the good. So we've created a very large target. But David bravely, has attempted to do this. He's made himself into the shooting target by taking the Jewish tradition from the beginning to the end and saying, you think some things left out? Tell me. You think something should be in there? Let's hear from you. And this is how a discipline comes to maturity. This is how a first draft of a study canon leads to a second draft, and finally to an agreed upon consensus among all participants as to what really they're talking about, that very question that you began with. Where does it begin? Where does it stop?
Yes, and where does it begin and how does it keep going? Because you worked on this for a very long time. And I wonder if engaging in this, you must have come across texts that suddenly struck you as especially meaningful or beautiful, and that really changed perhaps the way you thought about the history of Jewish thought, Judaism as a religion. And I wonder also if there's some secrets you uncovered. What has held all of this together? Because the texts you present to us are so disparate, as such an incredible range. And what's the longevity of all of this? How does it happen that these texts from 1,000, 2,000 years ago and longer mean so much to us today and are still active parts of our religion?
So those are many questions. In terms of texts that really begin to speak to me as I was putting them together, I particularly think about the marvelous translations of Peter Cole of
Yes.
Spanish Jewish poetry. And many of these poems are religious, or they use religious imagery, and so they fit in that sense. Some of them are really purely secular, and I couldn't resist. I had to put them in. These poems really demonstrate for us a culture that is as capacious as our own in terms of going from deep religiosity to very, very secular, even hedonism. And so those texts really did speak.
Tell us about a little about the fawn.
So
Fawn in those poems. Is it Eretz Tzvi? Is that representing? Is that why some of these poems talk about fawns?
Yeah, but I mean, they also use homosexual imagery, and one of the big debates is whether these poets themselves were perhaps gay, and they, or are they simply using Arabic sort of conventions as opposed to actually reflecting real life? And of course, it remains unknown, but the fact that they could even conceive of such imagery tells us a lot about the breadth of their imagination.
I'm not Jewish, and there are texts that I know for my friends here are very familiar, but they weren't so familiar to me when I started reading these. I think among these Spanish Jewish poems, My Heart is in the East is probably one that everybody knows.
Right.
But I didn't know it. And I really thought it was very moving. And it's moving in a way that I might not, particularly respond to in other contexts, but as expressed by Yuda Halevi, it was really very affecting. You've written a whole book on the title, Not in the Heavens. And maybe there are some people in this audience who are not Jewish. Can you tell them where that phrase comes from?
So it's this famous rabbinic text where the rabbis are in disputation, and there's one rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, who's in the minority of one on a particular legal point. He tries to invoke different miracles on his side to show that actually heaven is on his side, and the majority dismisses these out of hand. We don't listen to, if you can make the water run uphill, we don't listen to that kind of argument. And finally, in the end, he invokes God himself, who says that Rabbi Eliezer is in the right, and the rest of the rabbis say, we don't listen to a voice from heaven. The Torah is not in the heavens. It is here on earth, and we interpret it, and we say what it means. That text
and God says?
And God then laughs and says, my sons have defeated me. It's a very complicated text. It goes on, and that's not the full story, but this is a very important text for me. Not only for me, it's generally among people who study rabbinic Judaism, a very well-known text and debated as to what it actually means. But I think it's very important for our anthology as well, because although I use it in my book as a kind of a jumping off point for thinking about secular Jewish thought, it's important for our book because so much of this book is really about human beings, Jews over the centuries, who have debated this tradition and given it their interpretations, and in which they, so to say, ward off heaven. They're not going to let a divine voice determine what is their interpretation of these texts. So that to get back to Susannah's question, I think the vitality of this tradition is precisely the way in which, from a common scripture, you can develop so many different genres, so many different ideas, contradictory ideas, high philosophy, rational philosophy, and
poetry.
And this kind of poetry and demonic folklore. The tremendous range and vitality is, I think, what I would hope the reader would tap into. And insofar as the anthology can serve any particular function for Jewish life, it would be to expose people to the vastness of the tradition, what is traditionally called the sea of the Talmud.
Well, you know, I hear you too. The way the two of you started talking about this. What are we going to add? You know, how do we go on from here?
We didn't start with what's in there. We started with what's out.
What's still to come. And you, in your introduction, the first thing you say in your general introduction is the Jewish tradition is an anthologistic tradition.
Right.
It is an anthology itself from the beginning, meaning a collection.
Well, you know,
Add to
Jack,
the collection.
it is a collection of texts, but I think sometimes there's also a danger that we become idolatrous about our texts. Sometimes in Judaism, the problem can be that halakha, Jewish law, replaces God, for example. Sometimes certain aspects of Jewish politics function that way. So there is a danger of an idolatry of the text that's worrisome. And I think in this sense, what we need to do with this anthology, since it is very much for teachers, something that is going to be taught, is to think about how we read the different texts and read the texts in different ways. We have texts in your collection in Judaism, philosophical texts, for example, that are difficult to read and have to really be pondered, let's say. And then there are other texts that are poetry and that are beautiful, inspiring. We also have, you've given us texts from liturgy, from the prayer book. And of course, the way you relate to a prayer book is entirely different. You don't read a prayer book, you pray a prayer book. And so one of the questions would be, and you would want to, of course, discuss this with the people who will be teaching this book in colleges and universities, but how do you convey to people how the text is read so that it doesn't become an idolatry of text, that there is a subjective factor here, that there is an experience, something personal, there is a religiosity behind the religion?
Well, I mean, you're quite right that there are many texts which are performed and which cannot be appreciated if they're not performed. So we include a good chunk of the Passover Haggadah. The Passover Haggadah is not simply a book that you sit in your study and read. It doesn't really work that way. It has to be read with all this food on the table and children running around and wine spilling, and it is a very experiential thing, and I think that definitely cannot be conveyed by our anthology, and I'm not even sure what we could do to address that. I mean, except that in the way in which people will use this book in teaching, they have to understand that the book is not sufficient by itself. That seems to me essential, and your point, I think, brings that home. The Norton anthologies have become, over the last, they've been coming out for, 50 years or so?
1962 was the first edition of the Norton Anthology of English Literature.
Okay, so we're talking about over 50 years, and in many ways, these anthologies have become canonical texts, which is very interesting, how they've assumed that position in the culture, and college students who will sell off their textbooks when they're done will keep their Norton anthology and have it proudly on their shelves. So there is a danger with our book, I think, that it becomes that kind of canonical text, and does not, and just because it's in there, then that's what Judaism is, and it's that alone. There's no experience, there's nothing outside of the text, there's no argument about it. And that it's very hard to know how to address that problem within the confines of a book.
Within the confines of a book, and also because in the academy these days, everybody's challenging the canon and saying, let's open up the canon.
Right.
The canon has been too many white male authors and not enough, et cetera. So,
David, this anthology is probably going to outlive you and me.
Well, I certainly hope so for my children's sake.
As the Norton Anthology, it's now of English literature, it's now in its 9th edition, and things have been dropped out as well as added. And that will surely happen with subsequent editions of the Norton Anthology of World Religions. And then too, I use the analogy of going to look at a particular work of art in a museum. You can plunge, into the middle of the 2,000-page Judaism, Christianity, Islam volume to Gluchel of Hamel. It's a fascinating text for me, old hat for my friends, and read that text. But the explanation is quite concise. So the work is not written to replace the teacher. The work is written to get the teacher started in preparation that then can be brought into the classroom and bring the actual text to life as something that once was a living part of a religious community. Not an academic text. Primary text means that these were produced by people who were living the tradition in question for others like themselves. So it will change, over time. I hope that maybe, but the point where the Norton Anthology of English Literature first appeared in 1962, I think, was a moment when the discipline of English literature was on the cusp of agreement, and Norton cleverly said, now's a good time for us to move in and give them what we think they already want. And that's what we've sort of tried to do, but I think we're further ahead of the curve. They don't know yet what they want, so we're trying to get them started, I think, aren't we?
Well, I think we have pushed the envelope in certain ways in the Judaism volume, and I know that that's certainly true of the Hinduism volume, but in Judaism, we've included folklore of the sort that some people might reject as not really belonging to Judaism, as sort of disreputable. We've certainly included various women's voices, which I think are more accepted now, although not in every Jewish community. And we've included secular voices, not only in the Middle Ages, but primarily in the modern period. So we have pushed the envelope somewhat. I think there's a delicate balance here between if we're producing a book that is for people who may never have encountered these texts at all, we have to assume we have to be responsible about what we give them. That is, things that are generally acknowledged as belonging to the Jewish canon, while at the same time trying to push the boundary of that canon somewhat. And maybe we should have pushed it a little bit more. I'm not sure.
Well, we've been talking for a good while, and I've just been given a little set of questions here. So why don't we turn to these questions? And this is from Elizabeth Brannigan at Caroline Theater in Durham, North Carolina, who's listening in. How do you account for the survival of the Jews when all other pre-Christian societies have vanished?
I'm supposed to answer that.
No, not necessarily.
This is the reason that professors of Jewish studies get paid the big bucks, because we have the answer to this question. Obviously, this is an extremely difficult problem, and one of the things that I decided to do in my introduction, and actually, as looking back on it 4 years later, I was a little bit puzzled at my strategy, but I think maybe there was some justification. I actually give a kind of history of the Jews, and try to embed in that history the evolution of Judaism as a religion. But there's a focus on the history, on not really answering that question, which I think is extremely difficult to answer, but on giving the sense of the range that is, and I think one of the answers is certainly the fact that the Jews have been a very mobile people. I don't mean to necessarily celebrate diaspora as the solution to longevity, but certainly the fact that the Jews have moved from one place to the other has provided a certain impetus towards survival, a certain refreshing of the sort of cultural foundations of Judaism.
You know, may I
Yeah,
just
yeah,
say
please, yeah.
something? So that's a wonderful response from a historian. But I'm wondering, how do you think a religious Jew would give a religious answer to that?
Yeah, so I think that the answer is, and I don't think it contradicts a historical explanation, is that there is something in the original, the impetus of the religion, the revelation at Sinai, that clearly has a resonance throughout the centuries and can be interpreted in so many different ways that it never freezes, it never becomes fossilized.
But that's a sociological
Well, I don't think it's sociological.
What
No,
would
no,
you
no.
say
I
is
think it is.
a religious answer?
I think it is a religious answer. I think
I
that
think a religious answer would be that this is the will of God.
Well,
And the question is, how do we understand the religious belief and incorporate that and respect it in some way when we are scholars? But do we necessarily have to negate a religious claim when we want to explain and understand? That's the problem. What's the status of the religious belief when we want to operate as scholars and historians? Must we negate it?
So no, I don't think we have to negate it, but I think we can explain. We can explain it in terms of the creative response of human beings to that faith, that belief, and if the belief has a certain flexibility, then it can create a variety of responses that can be quite flexible in terms of changing circumstances. And I think that is where, now you may call that sociological, but these are the tools that we have as scholars to try to understand such a phenomenon. And it does not mean that we negate the belief of those people who say it is the will of God. But I don't think that most Jewish thinkers have been satisfied to simply say it's the will of God. I think most Jewish thinkers, they may start there, but then they have many other things to say, like this great story of Not in the Heavens.
I kind of want to put the question to you, Susannah, to answer your own question. How do you handle the belief versus learning matter in your own classes? I myself think that this is a question that can have various answers within a religious tradition. That is, I think it's possible for one person to have two, as it were, hats to put on. I can go as a Christian to the Cathedral of Chartres on Tuesday and hear an art historian lecturing me about the techniques that were used in producing the famous stained glass windows in that cathedral. And then I'm functioning as an art student, or vicariously as an art historian, and I'm not thinking about Jesus. I'm not thinking that these tall arches are intended to lift my eyes to the sky and to God who is above the sky. And then on Sunday I can go back and attend a religious service and allow all that to slip from my mind and operate in a different mode. But that's me. That's one person's response as scholar and practitioner. I like to use the word practitioner rather than the word believer. And I think in this anthology we've stressed the variety of religious practice and rather muted the centrality of belief, which isn't central in all traditions to the extent that it has been made central in Christianity. But even within Christianity, you can take a stance like that. Now, someone else might say, no, you have to be the same person at all times. You have only one hat to wear, and if it contradicts your belief, you shouldn't even be studying it. And that becomes then an anti-intellectual tradition that can be part of a given religious option. But I think over time, the drift is away from that kind of anti-intellectualism and toward more openness to other religions, toward the notion that he who knows one religion knows none. But I do want to ask you how you handle that question. Given your background and your association with someone who's such a great religious leader, how do you handle that matter in your own classes?
So I teach in a religion department, and I want my students to know, on the one hand, this is how a historian approaches, this is how a scholar, a sociologist, psychologist, et cetera, but I also want them to be able to articulate for themselves an understanding of what it is to be a religious person, or how a religious person would speak of his or her own faith, and to be able to respect that in some way. But I think we hold the two in some tension, and what concerns me is that as scholars, we sometimes simply negate what the religious person believes about God. We say it's because of some other factor. We translate it into sociological or psychological terms. That worries me for many reasons. It worries me, in fact, politically, because I think unless we can understand and articulate, we can't really cope. We don't know how to respond to people who have very, very passionate religious feelings. How do we respond to them? It's a difficult problem. So I'm not saying there's an answer, but I do think that built into the field of the study of religion, there is a problem of translating religiosity into some other terms. And there's a gap. So yes, we have to hold the two in tension. You said one day you're an art historian, another day you can go as a person of faith. That's exactly it. How can you be both in one day?
Maybe you can't. You know, a comparison that I make in the general introduction to what we're doing in this book that makes it different from a textbook. It's the difference between a history of Elizabethan England with a bit of Shakespeare and an introduction to Shakespeare with a bit of Elizabethan history. So for all the work that we've put in on this anthology, writing the headnotes, writing the footnotes, writing the introductions, we're just a bit of history. And the texts are the central power of the anthology, and they are really strong texts. So you may want to be very detached and historical and sociological, be as detached as you want to be, but these texts have a certain power, and someone may be hearing through you something that the text is trying to say that's not historical or sociological. I think they work that way on their own almost.
Yes, how we see the text, that in fact there was a Jewish thinker who said, when I look at a cross, I see a swastika. So people do look at these texts in different ways. But I'm wondering in this section, or do you want to go to the question? May I ask one more question?
Ask that question, and I'm going to go to a more playful question.
So when you're talking about Passover Seder, for example, in this section, you quote from Halach Ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction, or this is the bread of poverty. Now, according to a scholar, Israel Yuval, actually this is held up, this phrase is said at the Passover Seder to negate the Eucharist. And I'm wondering sometimes how much do we call it Jewish affirmation and how much do we call it polemic against someone else? Or is it the same? Does it not matter?
Yeah, well, Yisrael likes to see a polemic everywhere. I think that's a conceivable interpretation. I think it's a certainly interesting historical debate to have around that text, but I think for the purpose of our anthology, the way generations have celebrated the Passover has very little to do with seeing the matzah, the bread of affliction, as a counter to the Eucharist. And so those are two different, there's the experience or the understanding of the tradition, and then there is a particular historical interpretation, which may be correct and may not be correct.
But that's,
so we don't enter into those kind of debates, generally speaking, in this.
That's true.
But that's exactly what Jack was illustrating. In other words, there's a religious person's understanding of the meaning, and there's a historian's understanding.
Right, and I think that for the purpose of our anthology, I want to err on the side of the believer's understanding.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a more playful question. Professor Biale, how is Philip Roth a religious writer?
So, how is Philip
Roth? Philip Roth has the distinction of being the final entry in.
He gets the final word in 650 pages. A short section from the Counterlife in which he debates the question of the future of the Jews and what is the relationship, what is his relationship to this people beyond circumcision. So, he belongs there for two reasons. First of all, because he's raising this question to which we don't have an answer. And secondly, because that section of the last section is secular Jews confront the tradition. So I wouldn't just have any quotation from Philip Roth, but the point at which he's actually looking at this 3,000-year tradition and saying, how do I belong here? Or do I belong here? And what comes next? And that seemed to me to be a beautiful way to end 650 pages, although I think it was Jack's idea that we put him at the end.
We'll believe that. Can we bring the house lights up a little bit and see if there are some questions that we might be able to take from the floor here in the time remaining? Let's see if I can. I don't know. I don't know whether there's a mic or how we can do this. Susan, are you here? Do I see a hand? Over here.
Okay, I just finished reading this book by Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the
Bicameral mind.
Right, and he has a whole biological theory of religion, which is a new way, to look at. He's saying like it's basically inside of us, and that's why as history changes and people change, there's still that strong force that controls us that we don't control. So, what do scholars think of that idea?
Well, we don't. It's in the general introduction and preface that we take up general questions like what is religion, and can that question coherently be answered? And we recognize that there is actually no consensus in the field on that subject. Primary texts are those that are produced by religious people for their own use. We are a secondary text. There are also what you might call tertiary texts that try to take all data from all religions and boil them down and say they all come down to this. That's what Julian Jaynes was trying to do. My general impression about such attempts is that they deal with remarkably scanty bodies of evidence. So if our work taken collectively poses a challenge to that or makes a contribution, it would be by presenting a great body of evidence and saying, does your theory account for this? Have you taken this and that into account? And in that way, by bringing a great body of evidence to the fore, foster in the long run the development of an adequate theory of religion. But in general, we don't anthologize theories of religion, we anthologize religious evidence. Another question? Yes, in the very back row.
You mentioned the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, is there a contrast to start with that the Jewish tradition is that the Old Testament is God-given? There is no such claim about the New Testament.
Well, there is the New Testament is regarded as divinely inspired by Christians, not by Jews. The Quran is regarded as divinely inspired by Muslims, not by either Jews or Christians. That goes without saying. There are different canons of divinely inspired texts for different traditions. For Hindus, it's the Rig Veda. Am I missing the point of your question?
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I think I understand the
David?
point. I mean, God doesn't appear in the New Testament. He's not a character. In the
Yes, he does.
well, barely. I mean, he's really a very,
Barely, yes, except to the extent that if Jesus is regarded as God incarnate.
Well, okay, but I mean,
but even when
but
he's
the
not.
text doesn't really make that claim.
Well, but in addition, there are a few places where God speaks.
Yeah, okay, but it's very
Minimal.
much, if you compare it with the Hebrew Bible,
Where God's
where he's everywhere. He is, as Jack himself has written the book. It's his biography. That's really what that book is about. So it's very different just from a genre point of view. And there is a different religious sensibility at work. One can't speak of the Hebrew Bible as one book, obviously. It's many books. So yes, you're absolutely right. There is some kind of a really interesting shift that's taken place. But you can see that in Second Temple literature generally, this shift away from the sort of immanent presence of God. And that shift, this idea that God is somehow very distant, transcendent, is a shift in religious sensibility that affects Jews and also those Jews who created Christianity.
Is there another question? Well, let me turn to one of the other questions that came over the radio, or however we had it. Let's see. So I guess this could be to either of you, or I guess no, it's really to David, I think. Was it difficult as a secularist to overcome a sense of superiority over those who are religious?
You know, my whole, I would say my whole adult life is really about the question of how does a secular person think about religion? And not in the sense of superiority or inferiority, but it seems to me that secular people have inherited a long religious tradition, even if they don't practice it. And you can't simply divest yourself of this legacy. Mm-hmm. So the very first book I wrote, which was a study of the great historian of Jewish mysticism, Gershom Scholem, the question that interested me in that book is, how does a secular historian, Scholem was quite secular, how does he study religious tradition? How does he give it its full voice? And that seemed to me the challenge for me as well as a secular historian. Mm-hmm. I think that the challenge for me has always been to understand and appreciate the depths of religious belief and expression, even if they are not my own position. Just as a Christian can study Hinduism without becoming a Hindu. As they say, you don't have to be a triangle to study geometry.
Scholem said.
Scholem said that, yeah.
Really? Is that his line?
Well, I don't think he was the first to say that, but.
Did you want to say something?
Well, I'm not sure actually that Scholem gave Jewish mysticism its full due, and plenty of critics have said since then, so that's a problem.
We have a question here about the place of Islam in this anthology, that particularly considering the warfare that seems to be taking place today between Sunni and Shia. Does that sort of consideration enter into Judaism? But I think you certainly do have.
Well, Judaism and Christianity both went through a Reformation, and so the kind of this conflict that we see going on within Islam is something that happened in one form or the other much earlier, especially for Christianity in the religious wars of the 17th century. Judaism, because it didn't have a state, didn't wage war upon itself when it went through a Reformation. You can see some of that Kulturkampf going on in Israel today, but certainly not with the same kind of ferocity. It's interesting that it has been contained to the extent that it has.
Perhaps you might actually elaborate a bit on that point, because it brings us back to some of the material that you wish you could have included or you might include in the future. And I wonder how this anthology and religion might help us with some of the terrible conflicts that are raging over the state of Israel, over Zionism today. Is there anything that it can contribute? Zionism used to be a secular movement. Now it's become a religious movement. And these conflicts do exist, not in the same way, of course, as between Sunni and Shiite, but religious.
So I'm not at all sure that our anthology helps solve these problems. We hope to provide sources that deal with different expressions, different positions. but I'm not sure that solves the problems. I guess I'm rather modest or even pessimistic about our powers as scholars to affect contemporary politics.
Well,
Maybe
know what?
you have a more optimistic
I am
view.
more optimistic.
Good.
I actually think that this entire collection, all the volumes, the Judaism one, but all of them, can in fact make an important contribution. One of the things that you do in your anthology on Judaism is to show Jews the richness of texts that many people were never aware of. How many Jews know this broad range? Actually, very few, and perhaps it will turn them away from some of the political intensity and help them relax into an appreciation that Judaism actually has many dimensions, not only the political. And
There are many
perhaps
ways to be Jewish.
many ways to be
Well, I hope that's true. I mean, that would
You know, years ago, I was working as an editor in a publishing house in New York. Part of my responsibility was books on religion. And one of my fellow editors was an editor for Isaac Bashevis Singer. And we had a little kind of a club, we who had religion as part of our editorial responsibility, different publishing houses. We would get together for lunch a couple of times a year. So we were all excited because Eve had procured Isaac Bashevis Singer as speaker. And one hand was raised during the discussion after he gave his remarks and said, "Mr. Singer, what can we do to make the world a better place as writers and editors?" And he said, "As writers and editors, I don't think you can make the world a better place. On the other hand," he brightened, "I don't think you can make it any worse."
I mean, I would like to believe that some of the most fanatical figures would dip into our book and become less fanatical, but I'm not sure it works that way. But yes, I would hope that it could give a kind
So
of...
we have the optimist and the pessimist.
Right.
You could, in fact,
should be the
spark
optimist.
another Haskalah with this, which is so needed in the Haredi world.
That would be terrific. I mean, I'd be curious to know how many Haredi readers we will have.
We'll find out. We'll find out.
We should make sure it's taught in yeshivas,
We should,
right?
we should do that. Our time is up. I want to thank our speakers for their terrific contribution and you for your kind attention.
Fun.